this tomorrow. And what I've got here is what's the state of the war and what's the end game. This is kind of like transitory inflation. Yeah. It's a crystal ball. We really don't know what's going to happen, honestly. The fall of the Soviet Union was overnight, very quick. And my belief is the regime change will also happen very quickly without notice. Moving on from that, obviously, everyone knows Russia's losing very badly. These are decisions that not only the military, but Putin himself has been directing the war. He has been trying to set up scapegoats for the loss. Those scapegoats range from FSB to the military. Unlikely that the scapegoats will be FSB, more likely it'll be the military. So what are the challenges that Russia's facing right now? You've got the upcoming winter. The Ukrainians have recovered some 6,000 square kilometers of territory, over 100,000 villages liberated. Can they hold that? Depends. As long as NATO and the Western allies remain united and provide the Ukrainians with the military equipment that has brought them to this point, yes, they can. I believe they can push the Russian army all the way back to the border. So with the winter coming, one needs to keep in mind that both Ukrainians and Russians have been very successful in winter conflict. Napoleon, Germany, what have you. So now you've got two armies that are accustomed to winter conflict, winter warfare. But in this situation, the Ukrainians are fighting for their homes, they're fighting for their land. The morale in the Russian army is very, very low. That is a challenge that the Russians have. The equipment, they're buying equipment from Iran and from North Korea. So that gives you an insight as to what's happened to the military industrial complex within Russia. On top of that, with the sanctions, particularly microchips, this Iskander precision missile, Russia has depleted that inventory of missiles, and making those missiles again, as they did in the past, is going to be impossible without those critical chips. Those are the challenges. Again, I think the key is the European and NATO unity in this.
I heard the chips that they're getting are 40% are defunct.
Well, that's true of the equipment that they're using as well. The drones are not so good. Neither is the ammunition that they're getting, and the training that they're providing for the conscripts. That's another challenge that they have. Putin announced that it wasn't Putin. It was I think it was the defense minister Shoigu announced that the conscription will end. No, it was Putin. Conscription will end. So they're about 66,000 short of the 300,000. Now, why is it going to end? Because he has a battle not only in Ukraine, Putin does in his party of war, they've got a battle domestically as well. Once those wives, grandmothers, and mothers start protesting, and we're seeing that, that's going to be problematic for Putin. It's going to be very difficult for him to get Rosgvardia out there and squash these protests. They're the same people, they're neighbors, you know. Another interesting thing domestically is the anti-corruption foundation, Navalny's anti-corruption foundation in They have announced that they're going to reopen their network, opposition network, but underground. Now, how exactly that works, don't know. But you're seeing things coming together that could very well be a perfect storm for regime change. Going into regime change, when that will happen, what it will look like, no idea. That's going to be very quick. It will have to be, and I think Hamlet and I had some discussions about this. My view is for regime change to happen, you have to have someone inside the power structure that can work with the civil unrest. And on top of that, you need leaders. You need opposition leaders that are in country as well as outside of the country. Examples of civil unrest working or not working alone is Venezuela, Belarus. We've seen that. People coming out and marching, and if you don't have a leader, a strong leader inside the power circle, it's going to be very difficult to happen. Now, here I've got, these are just a few. There's many, many more in this party of war that are influential, but I would say that these are three of the four are probably the most influential, and Nikolai Patrushev, the one in the middle, is the most influential. He literally, he has Putin's ear. He's the man that whispers into Putin's ear. He is the one that has been the architect of the paranoid Russia, always on a war footing, that the West wants to destroy Russia. Narushkin, he's the foreign intelligence, and he's the one that was dressed down during that meeting.
I was gonna say, yeah, he was supposed to be scripted. He went off script, and Putin had to tell him what to say. Just so it was on record.
Well, not only did he go off script, he wasn't prepared. He didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, he was stuttering. So why is he here? He looks like, he doesn't look like a pillar.
He is still influential. What's interesting about that video, if you look at it again, and Narushkin runs for cover in it by mentioning Patrushev and saying that he had talked to Patrushev, and we are ready to annex the territories, and the discussion wasn't about annexing. So
right.
And then you've got Gerasimov, who is the architect of the he's the chief of generals, and he is the military doctrine of warfare, scorched earth. Igor Gorinkin, Sterkov, he was the guy out in Donbass, former FSB. He has a big following within the right wing of FSB. Most of FSB is very, very much to the right anyway, but he's got quite a following, and he does wield some influence, particularly with the nationalists and those right wing people. So this is one group of people to keep an eye on. Will that palace coup, for lack of a better description, come from any of these? No, I don't believe so. Probably it may come from, I do believe it's likely to come out of the military, because the military is the one that's being set up as the scapegoat and being thrown under the bus because of the failure of the war. So it could come out of a lieutenant colonel or a lieutenant general. We'll see, who knows? But you have to have somebody from the inside. In addition to somebody from the inside, the next, let's see here. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so now we have dissidents and opposition, and this is just a few of them. Okay, there are many more. Of course, Alexei Navalny, who's imprisoned, he has a strong following, but his following is mostly generational. They're younger people. They're between in their 20s to mid 40s. He has a following. Ilya Pomorov is a former Duma deputy. He lives in Ukraine. He's a candidate also in leadership in a future provisional government, or however you might want to call it. He has established a media platform in Ukraine that targets Russian soldiers, and talking about the war, telling the truth about the war. He's another candidate. Vladimir Kazamuza, he is also a former.
At that point,
and he's in jail right now.
aren't I think, sorry, Adam, aren't I seeing that for the first time, and we question is how they did it, the media is criticizing the war efforts or tactics, I should say.
Yes.
And the question is like, who's permitting that? It's almost like this is being orchestrated already.
Why is that happening is the question. How is it that they're letting that happen? There's a lot of theories to that. And obviously it has to come out of the Kremlin, because those mouthpieces do not say anything without the approval of Putin and that small circle.
Is that part of throwing the military under the bus?
I think it is. I think it's part of throwing the military under the bus. One of the governors of the occupied territory that was appointed by Russia had he said that General Shoigu should shoot himself, or the defense minister should kill himself that would be the honorable thing to do, given the state of the war. So you are seeing more media criticism about the way the war is being prosecuted. So what they really want is an all-out war, not conscription of 300,000, conscription of 1,300,000, and send them to the front and annihilate Ukraine. That's what that far right wants to do. Now, they don't understand that domestically, that's not going to hold well with the wives, mothers, and the grandmothers, the other dissident opposition that you have here, probably the most powerful, I would say, if it has the right leadership. Let me get back to Alexei Navalny. While he has a strong following, that following isn't so much about him. It is with the younger people. But when he has organized many of those protests, I would call it the coalition of the fed up. It's the older people as well that sometimes come out, and they're just fed up with the state of affairs, the pensions. It's not necessarily a support for Alexei Navalny, but it is a way for them to let off steam. So back to your question, the criticism on Первый канал, on the national media, that I believe also is a process of letting out some of the steam, because they're simply not telling the people the truth, obviously. Yeah. And people are getting that information through Western websites where they go on and VPN, and they get the information, particularly the younger people. The older people watch they depend on the national news media. So here's.
Guys, you may answer the question. Keep going. Sorry.
No, go ahead. What was your question?
Well, do they have the bullets and the missiles to arm the 1.3 million that you're talking about? One, and number two, regime change doesn't sound so good.
They do not have the arms, and they do not have the capacity to manufacture the ammo and the arms because of the sanctions and because of decades of corruption. within the system, not just within the military, but the entire the intelligence services are completely corrupt as well. When you compare the intelligence services, the way they behave over the past decade versus the Soviet Union, big difference in terms of professionalism, in terms of efficacy, in terms of what they're able to pull off. Not today. And a lot of that has to do with corruption and in poor training and a lack of motivation. Now,
Carry on, sir.
these are some references and readings that I would highly recommend. One in particular is this Harvard study that talks about nonviolent uprisings and how over the past, since 1900 to today, where civil unrest in decades past have been 50% effective. Today, over the past decade, that's gone down to, if I recall correctly, it was something like 7%. And it's a very, very interesting study. The Institute of War, of course, if you want to know where the lines are and what the equipment is, highly recommend. Mark Galeotti, fantastic podcast, In Moscow's Shadows. Very, very good, very insightful. He is certainly an expert on the Russian criminal war world as well as intelligence world. And he does talk about the regime change as well. Stefan Korsak, very interesting. He does on his Facebook almost a daily blog of the state of the war. Very, very detailed, with pictures, with videos. Highly recommend following him as well. To your point, Mark, is regime change good or bad? We don't know. We won't know. If it's one, I don't believe the Russian people are ready to accept a continued war. I really don't see this going past the first quarter of 2023. I don't see how Putin can keep this going. He's running out of equipment. He's running out of friends. In terms of China, they've got their big 5-year party going on right now. Xi has to be very, very careful. If Putin loses this war, that will come back to Xi and haunt him internally. He will have some problems with that. I just don't see how Putin can keep this going.
Adam, can you talk about what Hamlet will speak about tomorrow and what DJ will speak about next week?
DJ will discuss more details about Russian policy or US policy towards it, the impact of this war on China, on Europe, and on the United States. But he's really he will focus more also internally on regime change. He and I had a conversation a few days ago, and we talked about how long can the Kremlin continue with this war.
Well, with OPEC cuts, energy prices, and they have food supply.
Yeah,
so
but
those are still factors.
Yeah, of course, those are factors.
And then Hamlet tomorrow, just to set the stage, what he will talk about.
Hamlet and I talked about, I think it was last week or might have been the week before, probably last week. I see, and I think Hamlet agreed, I see a common thread in what's happening in Iran, what's happening in Russia, and it's also happening in the United States, of course, to a much lesser degree and in a different process. And that common thread is generational changes. You've got the younger generation coming up, building wealth and demanding control over policy as well. What's happening in Iran, and Hamlet is the expert on that. I only what I read there. The similarities to 1979, the Shah's overthrow, and what's happening today are stark, very similar, but it's also a very different age. Yeah, you've got internet today. You've got even though they try to shut it down, you can't stop a 16-year-old or 20-year-old or 30-year-old from accessing Western websites. If you've got in the country, it's impossible. So, they also have little connection with that revolution. You have a similar thing in Cuba as well, where protests are starting to build up. And the president of the dictator of Cuba, Canales, he has no relationship with the Cuban Revolution. And because he has no relationship with that, he doesn't have the gravitas that Fidel or Raúl had, particularly with the older generation. The younger generation, they don't want this anymore. Many of them have obtained Spanish citizenship. Down here in the Keys, we get Cuban boats almost weekly, filled with 20, 30 people. It's incredible, sad, really, what these people are having to go through to find a better life. Unbelievable.
Adam, Andrew Voss has a question.
Sure.
Hey, Adam. Thanks, Mark. Adam, great job. Appreciate it.
Thank
I
you.
took one political science class at Denison, and Mark may remember this guy, Dr. Sorensen. Do you remember him, Mark?
Yes, you know what I learned so many things. This guy had security clearance. 1985, I was at high school at Newark Senior High School, took a class with him. He said that the Chinese saw like a rototill, and they said, no, we can't have those. We'll put all the people out of jobs.
Yeah,
Now,
that's right.
whole new landscape. But yeah, go ahead.
Well,
Dr.
the
Sorensen.
class I took, yeah, I forget the exact name of the class, but it was affectionately known as, the name of the class was Bombs. And he studied things like what you're talking about,
Yeah.
things like mutually assured destruction, things of that nature. When it comes
Yep.
to the subject of nukes, is this Putin's last arrow in the quiver? Is he only saber rattling? How seriously should we be taking that?
Andrew, based on my discussions with people who are much smarter and better informed in this area than me, the consensus seems to be that it's saber rattling. And a big question is about the command and control structure. Should Putin order the military to carry out a nuclear strike, be it tactical, be it whatever it may be? If it does happen, it's likely to be tactical, and maybe it's Snake Island or someplace that's not going to create too much, but that's a slippery slope. The question is, will the military carry it out? That's the real question. And my view is that they will not, because they are already being thrown under the bus. They're taking conscripts, throwing them into the front lines, into a meat grinder without any training. Yeah. At the end of the day, when this is all over, and when the war crimes trials begin, do you want to be the general there responsible for actually carrying out the nuclear strike? They know that they're losing. The Russian military knows that they're losing. And so do these right-wing advocates as well. So that that's my view, Andrew. Yeah.
How many
As a
more cruise
follow-up
missiles
to
do
that,
they have? Sorry, go ahead, Roger.
sure, thanks, Mark. As a follow-up to that, you mentioned that you think, I guess, Q1 next year, you don't see this war continuing, Russia's losing, etc. What are Putin's options then?
Look, it's a dictatorship. It's an authoritarian government. You know, there is no template for transition of power. I think what you'll probably have is he could be taken out, liquidated, he could be arrested. Don't know. I would think that they would probably kill him because you want to take out any potential rivalry. And this war has gone very, very badly for Putin. He miscalculated this in a big way. And he miscalculated it because it's a corrupt system.
Adam, have you heard the rumor I've heard about him having cancer?
Yeah, well, I've heard that. That's been going on for many years. And I don't see that as playing any big role. I don't know whether it's real or not. I don't think we really know whether it's real or not. Now, what kind of regime will replace the Putin regime? You know, maybe, hope is the last thing that dies. I certainly hope it's a more liberal oriented Russia. But one has to keep in mind that Putin has been in power for 22 years and he has been running a propaganda machine for 22 years. So it's hard. It will take some time to purge that ideology out of society.
Well, let's roll back. In Yeltsin's Russia, there were the nationalists, the communist nationalists, and then let's say the West-leaning Democrats. Kubayis, right? Who's now in Turkey.
Kontsov and
Prokhorov was hanging out in Israel or whatever. In that camp, if you think of Michael Calvi, that was with Bering Vostok, who was arrested because they touched a power circle that he didn't know he was touching, yada yada. But
correct.
I understood that Putin said not to arrest him, but there was a fight between the two, and he didn't win. Now it could be a myth, but there's struggles between those camps. I wonder, if there's ever, it might be a one step back to go two steps forward, unfortunately.
And Mark, that is exactly how Putin stays in power. Yeah, he pits the underlings against each other, and they're afraid to talk to each other about any kind of regime change because they don't know. Well, maybe being set up.
Bill Deichler, you want to? I'm remembering back at one point where you talked about that propaganda machine touching, really cultural themes that have been around for centuries. But
yeah,
that may not be your comment, Bill. What's your question or comment?
Yeah, well, I guess to follow on with that, and Adam, you've probably hinted at it as well. This whole philosophical view of Russia being a unique country, the Russian people being a unique people, and that there's a true sense of destiny about all this. My guess is that tends to fuel the right wing, and I've got a follow-up question after that.
Well, yes, I mean that goes back to Tsarist times, Soviet times, and to today. There is no difference, Bill, between Tsarist power, Tsarist governance, and Soviet governance, really. You have the party, you have the elite, just like in Tsarist times, you had the blue blood. They did make some efforts to transition, but it was too late in 1905, 1915, and 1917. Today's generation, the younger generation, is not as tied to that ideology of destiny, of Russian destiny. They've traveled. They're well educated. Many of them, particularly out of the wealthy class, many of them have been educated here in the United States, as well as the Netherlands and throughout Europe. So I think that generational change plays a big role in changing society's view in terms of, is this our destiny? Yeah. They in my travels, whether it's in Spain, whether it's in Russia, Ukraine, Latin America, here in the United States, the average citizen, all they want to do is make a decent living, send their kids to school, and get a good education. Yeah.
Oh, you had a follow-up question?
Yeah, changing gears a bit, and maybe this is a Hamlet question. What do you think of the possibility of a clandestine strike on the armament factories in Iran? You think that's at all in the cards?
Is Hamlet here?
No.
Well,
Let that.
Where
come
is he
back-
when we need him, right?
I'll
Bill,
step
come,
out.
come back
I'll
tomorrow. It's
step out of my
11:15.
lane. I'll step out of my lane and address that. I think if there is a strike, it'll come out. The Israelis will do that. What's interesting, and I'm sure Hamlet will touch on this tomorrow. The Israeli intelligence is very deep and working very well in Iran. They know where these factories are. They have operatives in the country. I mean, you could see how the scientists were killed, 2 of them not too long ago. Could it happen? Sure, I think it could, but I'm the wrong person to ask.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Hamlet, go ahead.
Thank you for fielding it.
You're welcome.
Andrew's got another question.
Hey, Adam, in this type of a conflict, to what level are defections a consideration from top brass down to young soldiers out in the field?
Huge.
And related to that, Adam, how many have left the country since they announced the draft?
That's kind of like determining what are the wounded and dead. The figures run from 300,000 to 1 million people that have left. Of that million, it's thought that it's around 300,000 that have left the country. Talking about Russian recruits. I have a friend, I think I told you, a former colleague who flew from Moscow to Istanbul, Mexico City, and crossed the border seeking political asylum. I've got another friend who is in Dusseldorf seeking political asylum. He flew out. He told me that actually just yesterday or day before yesterday, last week, the authorities came to his apartment where his ex-wife lives, looking for him. Okay. So instead of taking him, they took his ex-wife. That was a joke about the ex-wife. But to answer your question,
Take my ex-wife, please. Is that the joke there?
Andrew, to answer your question, that's a huge problem because there's no motivation. You've got a conscription that's taking place. Your young people are leaving the country because they don't believe in the war. They don't believe in the war, and they know that it's a meat grinder. They know they're not going to get any training. They simply don't believe in the war. Now, if we get defections at the higher end, we're at the officer level, that's where there's potential for regime change if it can be coordinated with civil unrest and the dissidents' opposition. But that requires a lot of structure
Duncan.
and a lot of thought.
Duncan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think the story you're telling is so good, airtight on all counts. I guess wars have most wars, they start and then they end. And these guys are losing, so it's going to end. What I'm trying to understand is I've read a lot of all these, secret press reports about the mechanisms that Putin has around him. If somebody shoots him, the bodyguard gets $1 million to shoot the guy next to him. So all this cryptic, weird stuff that protects him. And I don't know what's true and what's not true. But I guess what you're saying is we're getting to a point where everybody knows they're losing. The military is getting blamed. So the pressure, somebody in the military has to get to a position where they have nothing to lose but to take him out, right? I mean, so what's real? Are you saying we don't really know the mechanics of what will happen? It's just that it will happen. And are you saying the time frame for this you really think is like first quarter next year? I mean, it's the morbid curiosity I've really got here on how this actual change gets executed.
This, as I said when I started this is like predicting transitory inflation. Yeah. I just don't. This war is different than the Georgian invasion. It's different than Afghanistan. It's different than a lot of the other wars that Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union had. This is consequential. This is consequential for Russia. It's consequential for the world, for the globe. I do not see in previous conflicts, take Georgia, for example. In Georgia, that's a frozen conflict. Transnistria, that borders Moldova. It's actually part of Moldova, but it's a breakaway republic supported by Russia. Okay, those are frozen conflicts. They're not going to go anywhere. It's kind of like Cyprus. Yeah, it's not going to go anywhere. Ukraine is different. Ukraine goes to the heart of the ideology of the Russian Empire, which the Soviet man, being Petrushev, Putin, Narushkin, all of them in that older generation, they never accepted Ukrainian sovereignty. Neither did they accept sovereignty of Georgia or any of the former Soviet countries. The other day, this was in, I think it was in Tashkent, where there was a meeting of the Central Asian countries, and Putin was there as well. And the president of Tajikistan, Rahmon, was rather combative with Putin, saying, our people go and work in Russia. They are also concerned about their own territory, Kazakhstan in particular, because you have a high population of Russian ethnics in the north, which is part of the pretext for Donbass, to protect the ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. Same thing Hitler did with Austria. Okay. I just don't see how this is sustainable, given the poor state of the military and their equipment and civil unrest. I don't see how he keeps this up.
Well, I have 3 minutes. Any different perspectives? If anyone wants to weigh in?
Actually, Mark, a question for Adam didn't come up so far. So it seems to me that part of the game Putin is playing, which he's not going to say, not going to announce, is a long game degradation of the Ukrainian people vis-a-vis their infrastructure. Lately, it's more obvious attacking power stations, substations, let's assume to freeze them out for the winter, et cetera, et cetera. That's not something he's going to advertise to his own people for obvious reasons. So how do you see that as part of this whole?
That's a good question. That war of attrition, how real is it? Yeah, it is real. I think it really depends on, as long as NATO and the Europeans remain united, as long as we're supplying weapons, as long as the news cycle doesn't suddenly change, I don't see how Russia can survive. They are fighting, they are the aggressors. The army doesn't have passion in their heart. It's winning the hearts and minds of the people. Even if they do militarily take over Donbass, even if they're able to militarily take it over, they will never win the hearts and minds of the people in the Donbass after all of these killings, rapes, and bombings.
Yeah,
Just
that's
not gonna
exactly.
happen. You will have an insurgency in that area that will just drain the Russian economy. And the Russian economy is not in a position to rebuild the Donbass.
But Adam, will that happen before he can break the back of the Ukrainian civilization, not the military?
I believe so. I believe so. I think the Ukrainians are very strong. They have purpose. They have passion. And I think that the hearts and minds, that will win over any aggressor. As long as they
Well,
have.
Adam, thank you for setting the stage. Again, to remind everybody, tomorrow at 11:15, Hamlet Yusuf of Iron Gate, which is a fund that's focused on dual use national security cyber investments, will be here, and he'll also talk about Iran. And then a week after, DJ Peterson, who follows these also the intelligence related matters in these regions, will be on. So, and thank you to many of you who were in the chat giving me your private insights into this. Not wanting to be public, but this is useful for us to sort of gather and shed light on all this. And I know many of you have been on the front lines, but I'll sort of leave it with you all to, if you want to continue to discuss. Many of us, or some of us, have to go off onto another Zoom, but we'll do this again tomorrow and next Tuesday.
Come join our 361 Firm community of investors and thought leaders. We have a lot of events created by the community as we collaborate on investments and philanthropic interests. Join us.